friends, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to another issue of The Legacy. I'm James Boyd. And before we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to that URL in the lower right-hand corner of your screen if you're watching on video. And if you're listening to us, it's james-dave.com or james-dave.com. That's a website I've ran for almost 20 years now with my good friend and collaborator, David Pope. I talked to Dave on the phone recently, and I'm hoping I can get him to sit in with us on a future episode of The Legacy. Today we're going to talk about an area where the New Testament is curiously silent, and that's on the area of Jesus' childhood and early life. There are lots of theories about what Jesus did in his quote-unquote silent years, but at best they're all speculation. As we discussed before, the purpose of the Gospels is not so much to give us a detailed account of Jesus' life from start to finish. For the most part, the focus of the Gospels is the ministry years, the last 3 years before the crucifixion. Up to then, by all indications, there really wasn't much to report. By all indications, Jesus lived a fairly normal life that a young Jewish man would have lived in those days. As you remember, he was largely rejected in his hometown because of people's familiarity with him. Oh, isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary? So those who watched him grow up knew him well and apparently didn't see anything that unusual about him. In this study, I'm going to try to piece together a portrait based on what the scriptures do tell us, as well as what customarily Jewish families functioned like during that day. We do see that when Jesus was 8 days old, he was taken to the temple and circumcised, and he's officially given his name of Yeshua, or Jesus. Then 40 days after his birth, they go back to the temple to dedicate him as the firstborn son, and for Mary to undergo the ceremonial washings that the law of Moses required of new mothers. It's also noteworthy that Mary and Joseph's offering for that occasion was 2 pigeons, which would indicate, according to the book of Leviticus, that they were poor, at least during that time in their life. Now, Joseph's occupation as a carpenter or craftsman was considered a middle to upper middle class occupation, so maybe they were just going through a dry period in their business. We don't know for sure. While they're in the temple, they encounter an elderly man named Simeon, who's been prophetically promised that he would not die until he'd seen the Messiah, as well as an elderly prophetess named Anna. And given the prophetic insights these 2 people had, they both recognized Jesus right away, so that was quite an affirmation. Okay, next we're going to skip ahead as much as 2 years later. The king of the region at the time was a man known as Herod the Great. He was the founder of the Herodian dynasty that ruled over the Holy Land until it fell to the Romans in AD 70. Now, on one hand, Herod was a very effective ruler. He did try to court favor with the Jews by rebuilding their magnificent temple for them. But on the other hand, he was a very cruel, ruthless, paranoid man who oppressed the Jews with heavy taxation, and he had several members of his own family killed. Okay, with that in mind, I want you to go back to our last lesson where we talk about the Magi, or the wise men. Again, religious tradition has greatly misrepresented what who these men were and what their mission was. Based on the 3 gifts the Magi brought to Jesus, many have assumed that there were 3 wise men, and from then on traditions began to develop around their age and ethnicities. They were described as being an elderly Caucasian man named Gaspar, a middle-aged Oriental man named Melchior, and a young African man named Balthazar. But as we know, tradition is often inaccurate. Again, the Magi were from the region of Persia, which we now know as Iran, and they traveled in large groups. So picture a large caravan of dignitaries arriving on the scene, accompanied by as many as 1,000 armed guards with all the pomp and circumstance that would go along with that. They held positions of such high prestige they were known as kingmakers. Their blessing was seen as essential for a new king to come to the throne. And as we mentioned before, the gifts they brought to Jesus, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were customary gifts to honor a new king. So when Herod discovers they're looking for this new king of the Jews, he freaks. Herod meets with the Magi and asks about this new king, saying he wants to go worship him too. Of course, he's lying through his teeth. What he wants to do is to kill this new king before he become a threat to him. But the Magi prophetically warned what Herod was up to, and after they finish their visit with Jesus, they go home. When Herod realizes he's been outwitted, he commits a horrible, horrible atrocity. He orders every young boy in the region 2 years and under to be killed. And that's something that has caused his name to live in infamy ever since. But still, Mary and Joseph are divinely led to hide Jesus in Egypt until after King Herod dies. From there, they return to their home in Nazareth. And it's interesting to note, some archaeologists recently believe they have uncovered Jesus' childhood home under the Sisters of Nazareth convent. Okay, our next scenario occurs when Jesus is 12 years old. He's gone to Jerusalem with Joseph and Mary for the annual Passover celebration. Now, if you've ever been in a crowded shopping center or somewhere like that and you become separated from your child for even just a few minutes, you know how terrifying that can be. So imagine how it was for Joseph and Mary to be separated from Jesus in a large crowd for 3 whole days. No cell phones, no GPS, or any of the modern technology to help track him down. But when they do find him, he's interestingly in the temple asking questions of the temple elders. Now, Jesus wasn't being disrespectful to his parents, not at all. In fact, he seems almost surprised that they wouldn't figure out where he is. His response was that he needed to be in his father's house. So even at this early age, Jesus had at least some insight into who his real father was and that he was on this earth for a very special purpose. He was also approaching the bar mitzvah age of 13, where he would be recognized as a fully responsible member of the Jewish community. So maybe he wanted to get some special instruction from the elders regarding that, or who knows, he may have been challenged them in pushing their buttons like he'd be so good at as an adult. Would you like to be a fly on the wall to watch that? But from there on, it says that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. Now, Joseph and Mary did have more children, but we see that there was early on a degree of tension between Jesus and his siblings. John 7:5 indicates that, at least at this point, even his own brethren didn't believe in him. It's been speculated that since Jesus was born before Joseph and Mary were married, that there was some social stigma they had to deal with over that. Again, we don't know all the reasons, but we do know that later on his brothers James and Jude did come to faith and write books of the New Testament. Jewish boys were taught a trade by their father, or in Jesus' case, his stepfather. His stepfather Joseph was a carpenter, or as the Greek would indicate, a craftsman, which is a broader term. It could include carpentry, but not necessarily be limited to that. But regardless, it was very hard physical work. Jesus had a very blue collar upbringing. He knew what it was like to work for a living, to have to deal with customers on a day to day basis, on how to manage his finances, and all the other things we have to deal with in our lives too. But as ordinary as Jesus' early life was, it wouldn't stay that way for long. In the next session, we'll look and see how his public ministry would begin with his baptism. Until then, as always, I ask that you like this video if you enjoyed it, to subscribe to our channel, add any comments you may have, and of course, tell your friends to help us spread the word. In the meantime, keep it real, friends.